And now, Robert Caro, what a legend. His book, The Power Broker, is often called the single best book ever written about a city. He looked at the hidden powers that shaped New York, and he won the 1975 Pulitzer for that book, his biography of New York urban planner Robert Moses. I remember reading it and wanting to be a journalist because these were real people. He figured out what was going on, not just what was said, but what was really going on. And it's so current today that this lovely thing just happened also backstage, where I saw a 19-year-old student who heard that Robert Caro was going to be here today, and he drove from New York City. Jonathan Marty, 19 years old, had read The Power Broker and just wanted to come and hear what he had to say. A 1966 Nieman Fellow, Robert Caro is a two-time winner of the Pulitzer Prize for biography. In 2003, he won again for Master of the Senate, his fourth installment of The Years of Lyndon Johnson. He will tell us about a simple truth that he learned. The most effective way to write about power is through the lens of the powerless. Robert Caro.
Thank you. Mary, that was such a nice introduction that I'm reminded of what Lyndon Johnson used to say. When he got an especially nice introduction, he used to say he wished his parents were alive to hear it, because his father would have loved it and his mother would have believed it. But thank you. It's not only an honor for me to be asked to speak here at Harvard at this centennial celebration sponsored by the Nieman Foundation, but it's very touching to me also because my first book, The Power Broker, was conceived when I was a Nieman Fellow here at Harvard. In fact, there was a particular incident that's one of the things that made me decide to do the book. I was up here to study, to learn more about urban planning, so I was taking a course that was something about land use planning. It was taught by two professors who had written this well-regarded textbook on why, among other things, why highways get built where they're built. And they were doing this by means of a mathematical equation. And there were factors like population density, traffic patterns, elevation of grades, that sort of thing. And and each day they'd write the equation on the board and they'd add factors to it, and this equation was getting quite long. So when I was at Princeton, I was a very diligent note taker, and I was being a very diligent note taker in this course and writing everything down. And one day I suddenly thought, no, that's not why highways get built where they're built. I know why highways get built where they're built. They're built there because Robert Moses wants them there. And I said, in a way, I had been fascinated by Moses for some time when I was a reporter for Newsday. I was an investigative reporter who was getting more and more interested in political power because I was coming to really feel and understand that political power shapes all our lives in so many ways, really in so many basic ways. And I was coming to feel that there was an element of political power in New York City and New York State that nobody, including me, understood about it. The general assumption about political power, you didn't include it in your stories, but it was the underlying assumption, was that we live in a democracy and power comes from the ballot box, from people being elected. But here was a man who had never been elected to anything. And he had more power in city and state than anyone who was elected, more than any mayor, more than any governor, more than any mayor and governor combined. And he had held this power for 44 years, almost half a century. And with it, he had shaped our lives and the things that we do in it. If my wife and I wanted to play tennis, we played tennis at Hempstead Lake State Park, which Robert Moses created in 1929. If we wanted to go to the beach, we went to Jones Beach. If we wanted to drive into New York City, we could drive on the Southern State or the Northern State Parkways, which he had built in the 20s, or the Long Island Expressway, which he had built in the 50s and was still building in the 60s. If we wanted to go to Lincoln Center, he was responsible for that. So he was shaping the whole landscape of our lives, and he had never been elected to anything. So what was his power? Where did it come from? It seemed to me that no one, including me, had any real idea. But although I had sort of been circling around this in my thoughts, it had sort of been a random circling or thinking. I'd never thought about this in any sustained way, because to excuse myself as a reporter, I always seemed to be running. I never really had time or took time to think. When I look back on those years as a reporter, I loved being a reporter, but it seemed to me I was always running either physically or in my head. But that day in the Harvard classroom, in that course on land use planning, looking at that equation made me think. I don't know if today's Niemans are given their own offices. I forgot to ask that. But in those days, you were given a little office. I had one in Leverett House. That year, my wife, Ina, her mother was very sick, and she had to be back home taking care of her a lot of the time. I've never been one for going to social events by myself very much, so I would spend a lot of evenings in that office thinking. It was really the first time since I had gotten out of college that I had had a chance to really think. And what I thought about was what I really wanted to do was examine political power in New York City and New York State. And that if I did it right, I could do this through the life of Robert Moses. And that, in fact, if I succeeded in getting to the root of his power, finding out what it was, I would be throwing sort of a light on real power, urban power, power in cities, not the power that we're taught about in textbooks, but if you want, the raw, naked reality of power, because somehow Robert Moses was the man who was using this to create an entire landscape of New York. So at first I thought of doing that examination through a series in Newsday, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized that it was just too big, that it was be too long, just to try to find out and figure out what his power was, let alone write it, and that it would take a book. So I wrote a book proposal. I didn't know any agents. I knew exactly one editor in New York. I sent him the proposal. I got a contract. It was a very small contract. It was for $5,000, of which they gave us $2,500 in advance. But that was really how the book started, up here at Harvard. And I thought that this book, at first, was going to be an examination of what I've just been speaking about, an examination of the workings of political power, how it was amassed, and how it was used, the workings, as I say, of political power. And then came the moment that I'm going to talk about this afternoon, the moment in which something happened that suddenly made me understand that if I wanted this biography of Robert Moses to be what I wanted it to be, the book would have to be a very different book from the one I had started out to write. The moment came when I was researching Robert Moses's fight during the 1920s to get the Northern State Parkway built on Long Island. Long Island, as you know, is a long, 116 miles long island that reaches out from eastward from New York City. And Moses was trying to make it accessible to New York by building the northern and southern state parkways. Now, Moses originally wanted the northern state to run out Long Island through the island's beautiful North Shore. But it doesn't, in fact, run there. It's suddenly, in a place called Cold Spring Harbor, it starts out running along the North Shore, but suddenly in a place called Cold Spring Harbor, it takes this big dip south and thereafter runs in the center of the island, flatter, less scenic. Moses himself had said once he would never agree to build it there. So in the files of his commission, it was called the Long Island State Park Commission, and managing to gain access to those files is another story in itself, which I was thinking about today. But in those files, I found the map of the route he originally wanted. But the Parkway, as I said, doesn't follow that route. There's a big curve in Cold Spring Harbor which takes it down abruptly to the south for more than 2 miles, almost 3 miles. I had been curious about what made him change the route, because he didn't like to change things that he had decided. There was great power and wealth in the North Shore then. This was the late 1920s. It was the Gilded Age, the age of the robber barons. And the robber barons had concentrated their country estates on the North Shore of Long Island. It was called the Gold Coast. There was so much political money available from the North Shore of Long Island that the Republican National Committee had 49 separate finance committees, one for each of the 48 states and one for the for Nassau County of Long Island. So when Moses was wanting to run this parkway through their estates, he was really taking on the concentrated power, the greatest concentration of power in one place probably in the United States then. But Moses had there was also a cluster of them along the route of the Southern State Parkway. And he had fought them there and had beaten them there and run the Southern State Parkway through their estate. What had made him change this time? When it was first proposed that he shift the route south, he had said flatly he would never do that. So what had made him do it? Finding out, I must say, and I've been remembering this the last couple of days, was not easy. This occurred in 1929, this shift. The governor was Franklin Roosevelt. So I went through all the Roosevelt papers at Hyde Park that seemed to relate to it, but I couldn't find very much on it. But then I was thinking, well, he got the idea for the Parkway back when Al Smith was governor. Maybe there's something in the Al Smith papers, something great. Those of you who are reporters and Nieman fellows here, I'm sure you know what I mean. There's something really great about going through old files. There's something thrilling about it. The Al Smith papers weren't in the state archives. They were in a warehouse in Albany, and I would call for the ones dealing with whatever seemed to relate to this. And they'd bring them over, and there would be file folders. And when you pulled the file folder apart, the file folder would break because Smith had left the governorship in 1928, and evidently no one had looked through these files in the 40 years since then. Then in some of the file folders, I remember there were envelopes, still sealed. No one had ever bothered to open them. And you'd open these envelopes, and no matter how careful you were, as you tried to open the envelope, it would fall apart in your fingers. But in the Smith papers, I found enough of a story to realize what had happened to the Northern State Parkway and Cold Spring Harbors. So the robber barons had stopped Moses. One way they had stopped them was using their power in the legislature to stop all appropriations to the Long Island State Park Commission, particularly the ones for surveys of highways. So without being able to survey the route, Moses was really stopped. But there was a letter there from a lawyer in the Smith papers, and I learned from it that a financier named Otto Kahn, who happened to be a distant cousin of Robert Moses's, he was one of the great financiers of the era, he owned a huge estate in Cold Spring Harbor, on which he had constructed his own private 18-hole golf course. Moses's route for the Northern State Parkway would run right through the middle of that course. Kahn offered to secretly donate $10,000 to the Long Island Park Commission for surveys on condition that the surveys found a new route for the Parkway in Cold Spring Harbor, a route which would not cross his estate at all. And Moses accepted the offer and shifted the Parkway off Kahn's estate. But the shift didn't stop there. Just to the south of Kahn's estate lay the domains of two other robber barons, Colonel Henry Rogers Winthrop and a very powerful congressman named Ogden Livingston Mills. By moving the route off Kahn's estate, it was going to cross their estates. And to avoid their estates, Moses had moved the Parkway still further south so that it wouldn't touch their estates either. And since that shift meant that it would cross the estates of two other great barons, Robert W. DeForest and Colonel Henry L. Stimson, Theodore Roosevelt's Secretary of War, when they also objected to having the road run over their lands, he shifted it south again, laying out its route eventually almost 3 miles south of its original location. So I had found the explanation, how in exchange for a $10,000 donation to keep a millionaire's private golf course untouched, Moses had changed the route of the Parkway. And then to avoid antagonizing other men of power and wealth and influence, had changed it again and yet again. How the one-time idealist and scorner of power had been transformed into the realist who played by the rules of power. When you encountered power and wealth, and it was blocking what you wanted to do, as the legislature was blocking the Parkway by refusing to make an appropriation for surveys, one of the first rules is that when power meets greater power, as Moses had done when he ran into the robber baron's power over the state legislature, it does not oppose, but attempts to compromise. If you can't get money for surveys without giving power what it wants, making sure their estates would be undisturbed. Later, of course, when Moses had amassed his great power, his methods would be very different, but this was a stage in the evolution when he was still young. I needed to document this to see if the explanation was correct. I got an old map of Suffolk County, including Cold Spring Harbor. And from the Long Island State Park Commission, I managed eventually to get their maps. And by superimposing upon the state map, the commission's maps of the Parkway in the order of their various dates, showing the various routes Moses had successively proposed for the Parkway, seeing the route move south and south again, and finally a map showing the route on which he finally actually built it, I found that the dates on the maps documented the transformation. It was quite obvious how he had kept moving the road south until it avoided completely the biggest states. I wanted to write about the change in the route because I felt it was significant not merely from a planning standpoint, but as an illustration of the change in Moses himself, from an idealist to a man who played by the rules of power. And the map showed clearly what he had done. There were the various routes, as I say, each one further to the south, each one avoiding another estate. I had the explanation, an explanation of some of the workings of power. That was what I thought my book was about, and I was getting ready to move on to the next subject in my research. And then something happened. The something that was to change my idea of what I should be trying to do with my book. On those maps, the huge estates of the robber barons Otto Kahn, Colonel Winthrop, Congressman Mills, DeForest, Stimson, hundreds of acres, most of them, were shown as big, empty white spaces with nothing within the boundary of each but the name of its owner. Each name surrounded, as was perhaps fitting for men who could buy isolation from the public, with a lot of white space. Some of them were 800 acres, and 800 acres is big on a map. And there the name was all alone in the middle of it. And that somehow lent weight to the names. So those estates were all I had been focused on because of their relationship to Moses and his fight for the Parkway and the fact that they hadn't had enough power to beat him. But that was not, of course, all that was on those maps. Below those estates, just to the south of the Stimson and DeForest estates, on the route of the Parkway, the final route, the route on which it had actually been built, was a row of tiny dots, little more than specks on the maps. Specks tiny even when I used the magnifying glass, 23 of them. They appeared to represent small landholdings, homes or farms that were merely indicated by those dots, the heavy line of the Parkway running right through them. They were much too small to have room on them for the names of the owners or any other kind of identification. To this day, I don't know why I suddenly decided to find out those names and to try to find any of the owners who were still alive and to see if they had any stories to tell about the construction of the Northern State Parkway. But I turned the task of finding them over to my team. My team is my wife, Ina. She's the whole team. The only person I have ever trusted, besides myself, to do research on any of my books. And Ina found the names. Since the names weren't on the maps, she went to the Suffolk County Clerk's office and got them off the old land title records. And we located some of the owners. That was harder. Today you have a national telephone directory. In those days, if someone told you that someone moved to Little Rock, you would have to get the Little Rock telephone directory and look it up. Most of the 23 people, most of those people who were involved were dead, and many of those who were still alive had moved away from Suffolk County to some other place in the United States. But as it turned out, at least one of them, a woman named Helen Roth, who along with her husband, James Roth, had owned a 49-acre farm south of Cold Spring Harbor in 1929, did indeed have a story about the Northern State Parkway, as did her son, James Jr., who in 1929 had been an 8-year-old boy called Jimmy. I talked to Mrs. Roth and Jimmy on the telephone. Mrs. Roth told me that when she and her husband had purchased their 49-acre farm in 1922, 7 years before, much of it had been woodland, and all of it had been rocky. James had hauled away the rocks and cut down the trees. Some of the stumps were too big and too solidly rooted in the ground for their team of 2 horses to budge. So as the horses strained at the stumps, James Roth strained beside them, pulling beside them, while Helen sat on one of the horses, kicking him forward, reins in her hand as she handled the team. The clearing of the land took years. After Jimmy turned 5 in 1926, he was considered old enough to handle the team, so his mother was freed for the pulling. The little boy would sit on the horse, holding the reins, while his mother joined his father, sweating at the ropes. Helen Roth told me how, after the land was cleared, they worked the farm. The soil of the southern 15 acres, she said, turned out to be too thin for planting. But the rest of the land, the other 34 acres, was rich and fertile, and the crops were good. At harvest time, her husband James, who had of course been up since dawn working the fields, would load up one of his 2 wagons and drive to market. While he was gone, Helen and Jimmy would load the other wagon. Every minute of time was precious to James. He was a farmer trying to work 34 acres without a hired man. So the minute he returned from market, he would unharness the team, hitch it to the loaded wagon, and make the trip again. Helen and Jimmy would reload the first wagon. It was a lot of work. But by 1927, Helen Roth told me, the farm had begun paying. When I talked to Jimmy, he put the phrase, begun paying, in the terms of the little boy he had been then. Well, we felt pretty secure, he told me. We had a nice farm. In those days, a farm was your living, it was your home. And we had a nice farm. And Mrs. Roth told me how, in 1927, a representative of the Long Island State Park Commission, of Robert Moses, drove up to the farm and told the Roths that the state was condemning 14 acres out of the middle of the farm for the Northern State Parkway. She told me how her husband had argued with the man who gave them the news, how he had pleaded with him, asking for just a slight change in the route, how he explained that if the commission would move the parkway just 400 feet south, less than 1/10 of a mile, the land that would be condemned would be in the barren southern part of the farm, while the proposed route would take a substantial part of the acreage that was fertile enough to support crops. And even more important, taking the land from the center of the farm meant that the farm would be cut in 2. How would he get from one side to the other? How would he be able to work it? Helen Roth remembered how she joined her husband in his pleading and how that hadn't helped, how Robert Moses' representative had refused to listen, how he said flatly that the Parkway's route had been decided on the basis of engineering considerations and that it could not possibly be changed. I must say now, as I speak to you this afternoon, that during this last week, as I was writing and rewriting actually this talk, as I remembered those phone calls I made, I heard again the voices of Mrs. Roth and of Jimmy in my ears some 40 years after they had spoken to me. I found myself as angry again this week as I was then. I remember my feelings, and I remember that when I finished talking to the Roth, the sentences for that part of my book just poured out of me. And now, years, decades later, when I reread those sentences, I am less dissatisfied with them than I usually am with my writing. I wrote, Robert Moses had shifted the parkway south of Otto Kahn's estate, south of Colonel Winthrop's and Congressman Mills' estates, south of Stimson's and DeForest's. For men of wealth and influence, he had moved the parkway almost 3 miles south of its original location. But James Roth possessed neither money nor influence. And for James Roth, Robert Moses would not move the parkway south even 1/10 of a mile. For James Roth, Robert Moses would not move the parkway 1 foot. Jimmy Roth, who had watched his father and mother sweating side by side over their land, told me about how in years to come, his father would keep talking over and over about what had been done to them. Quote, I don't know that I blame him for talking so much about it, Jimmy said. I'll tell you, my father and mother worked very hard on that place and made something out of it, and then someone just cut it in 2. The farm never paid again. There just wasn't enough fertile acreage left to make it pay, and the Roths found that it took fully 25 minutes to drive their team to the nearest road that crossed the parkway, and then to get back to plow the other side of the farm. Each trip took about 50 minutes, and these were 50-minute segments slashed out of the life of a man to whom every minute was necessary. It was quite a ways, Mrs. Roth said to me. It was quite a ways for a man who was working hard already. The condemnation award never came to much, she said. And because there were now two separate, rather small pieces of property instead of a single big one, they could not even sell the farm. Ina found some of the other families who were dots on the map. So over and over, I began hearing similar stories of how Robert Moses' Northern State Parkway had ruined their lives too. The injustice of it, the wrong of it. There had been no need for the Parkway to run through the Roth farm. Looking at the maps, it was clear that the route could have been moved a tiny distance that would have saved the Roth farm and their lives, and the farms and lives of 22 other families with very little difficulty. It was an empty area of farmland. Robert Moses just hadn't wanted to be bothered moving it. And because the Roths didn't have any power, he hadn't had to be bothered. And that was a lesson for me. Regard for power implies disregard for those without power. And the Northern State Parkway is a very clear demonstration of that. The map of the Northern State Parkway in Cold Spring Harbor is a map not only of a road, but of power, and of what happens to those who are unwittingly caught in power's path. And that factor, that regard for people with power and disregard for those without it, that fact was a factor in the equation, too, that belonged on any equation written on a backboard. It was a minor factor, but maybe it was not all that minor either. But whether it was minor or not, it was definitely a factor. So in order to deal with the equation of power fully, honestly, all factors accounted for, it was a factor that had to be taken into account, had to be discussed and analyzed, had to be shown, had to be written about. The story of the Northern State Parkway was not only the story of how Robert Moses dealt with the powerful, it was also the story of how Robert Moses dealt with those who had no power, with the powerless. So in that moment, in the moment when I learned about James and Helen and Jimmy Roth, things changed for me. My idea of what the book should try to be changed. I saw what I hadn't seen before. Whether it was right or wrong, I believed it. If my book was to analyze power fully, when it got to the Northern State Parkway, the story, if it was going to be an honest story, could not be only about the construction and the consequences of the Northern State Parkway. The story of these farmers was part of the story of the Northern State Parkway story, part of the Robert Moses story, part of the picture of power I was trying to learn how to draw. If my book was to tell the story of power in all its facets, all its aspects, it would have to tell the story not only of the man who wielded power, but of the effect of that power on those on whom, for good or for ill, it was wielded. And that I saw really, in that moment, as I recall it, was what I wanted my book to be. What I guess I had always wanted it to be. What I felt my book had to be if it was to accomplish what I wanted it to accomplish. In order to write about power truthfully, I decided it was necessary to write not only about the man who wielded power, but about the effect of power on those on whom it was wielded. I came to feel that a book about power, at least my books about power, wouldn't be really adequate if they were just about power. It has to be about other things too. And the thing we're talking about here, I came to feel, was justice and injustice. One other thing about that story may be of interest. Robert Moses had for years refused to talk to me. Finally, he did, and we had 7 interviews. I tried to word my question as circumspectly as possible, but I had to bring in the name Otto Kahn. As soon as I mentioned the name, I was watching Robert Moses and I saw his eyes change. A few minutes later, he broke off the interviews and he never spoke to me or saw me again. But my determination was fixed. In writing about power, I was going to write about its effect on those who had no power. Whether the effect was good or ill, it was going to have its place in the history that I was trying to write. Now, that decision had implications. For one thing, it makes my books longer. But, may I say, it has other implications. They weren't so great on Long Island, because what were we talking about there with the Northern State Parkway? Just 23 farms. But that was because Long Island in 1929 was a tabula rasa. It was the whole center of the island was an open space with just farms scattered on it. What would happen when the tabula changed? What would happen when the map on which Robert Moses was drawing his lines became New York City, when he was running his roads across densely congested neighborhoods? So very briefly, before I run out of time, Robert Moses built 13 great expressways across New York City, in addition to his urban renewal projects. I was able to identify, when I was writing The Power Broker, 21 separate neighborhoods that his roads or other projects destroyed. For those projects, for the urban renewal projects and the slum clearance projects, he relocated, but we can say more accurately, simply evicted from their homes, 250,000 people. For his highways, he evicted another 250,000 people. By the most conservative estimate I could come up with, and I still remember 40 years later saying, you better be very conservative about this. You better not let him be able to challenge it. He evicted 500,000 people. And his methods in building the expressways were the same as his method in building the Northern State Parkway. For one neighborhood, for one expressway, the Cross Bronx Expressway, he had available a route that would have required, in that mile, the tearing down of just 6 tenements. There was a broad avenue running parallel to the route he wanted at its southern border of the neighborhood, and then there was the top of Crotona Park. So he would have had only to tear down 6 buildings. But doing that, at the end of it, another mile further, the road would have curved back and required the destruction of a business in which any number of Bronx politicians were making a sizable income from. So he didn't take the alternate route. He took the route that would avoid that business. And in doing so, in that 1 mile, he tore down 54 apartment houses containing 15,000 people. Really, you could say he not only changed the lives of those 15,000, he changed the lives of 50,000, because the entire neighborhood was so disrupted and dismantled with the highway coming towards it that the whole neighborhood was turned into a slum. At the time that I was researching these expressways, there were a lot of articles on expressways and books were starting to be written. And they all sort of mentioned, as part of what I would call the equation that I was talking about before, they all used the phrase human costs. But not one of them really went into what the human costs were. I said, I'm going to try to find a way to determine and write about what those costs are. I don't say I succeeded, but I tried to do that, to show what the human costs of these projects is. It's not easy to do that. At the time, that makes the books longer. It also takes the time that it takes to do these books longer. At the time, Ina and I were quite broke. I said, I'm going to have to find a lot of the people who lived here before and create the picture of the neighborhood as it was before the Cross Bronx Expressway came through. They're going to be scattered. I'm going to have to interview them. It's going to take 6 months more for the books. Ina, of course, said you have to do it. Anyway, I told that story. It took 6 months, as I say. Actually, it took 8 months. I found out when I went back over my notes now. It took a long time to research, but I knew the story belonged there because I had learned the lesson years before with the Northern State Parkway. To write about power truly, it is necessary to show the effect of power on those who don't have it, on the powerless. Thank you.